never told me what you think you told me. Or maybe you think I'm somebody else.
Welcome to the Public House Podcast.
Now serving behavioral science and firearm safety.
I'm Dr. John O'Neill.
And I'm Dr. Don O'Neill.
So what we're going to be talking about today is, of course, as Dr. Don just mentioned, firearm safety in relation to our unintentional discharge of firearm studies. We have a series of 3 studies that were published. The first 2 were published in Applied Ergonomics, and the final review paper, a combination of the first two data sets, was published in the Journal of Organizational Behavior Management, and those can be found on our website, ResearchGate, Google Scholar, and anywhere else you find research articles. But if you can't find them, shoot us an email, we'll send them out to you. So although our studies involved exclusively law enforcement entities, the concept or phenomenon of unintentional discharges applies to a wide variety of firearms uses. So it's not just relevant to police and the military, but public ranges, hunters, concealed carry. There are a variety of other areas in which this applies. So we're actually working on an infographic that could be distributed to police academies, to public firearm ranges, hunting areas, with general information about the training recommendations and to raise awareness about the types of behaviors that can result in unintentional discharges.
So part of the purpose of this podcast is to disseminate behavior analysis, and I wanted to mention that's something cool that I think we did by publishing the first 2 studies in Applied Ergonomics, because that, although related to behavior analysis, is its own field. So we were honored to be able to publish this novel research in a journal in a field outside of our own. And we're very fortunate that John's review paper was then in his taxonomy and applying that to some very real takeaways, was then published in a flagship journal of behavior analysis in JOBM.
Yeah, and another piece that came out of these studies was the development of the functional behavioral assessment of unintentional discharges. So we developed a standardized form for recording and reporting these details, including the types of firearm, the mechanisms involved, the behaviors, context, and stress level associated with unintentional discharges. So hopefully we can at some point have a database packed full of examples and data sets relevant to unintentional discharges around the U.S. and hopefully the world. So, let's do a little bit of background first. So I grew up around firearms since I was 10 years old. I used to go to the range with my dad, and I did a lot of scoped sport rifle shooting. So that involved a bolt-action rifle with a scope, a spotter, at pretty solid distances outdoors. It was a lot of fun. I kind of grew up on firing ranges going, every other weekend, or that's what it seemed like anyway. It may have been much less frequent, but anyway, fond memories. And my dad always had firearms around the house. We had a small farm. We had a lot of animals, including sheep, that occasionally would be attacked by neighborhood dogs that had packed together and were attacked.
The old wild Irish dog.
The wild Irish hounds.
Beware.
Yeah. So we did have that occur occasionally in the night, so we needed a shotgun around to scare them off, and foxes as well. We had foxes that would come in and kill chickens and that sort of thing. So we always had firearms around the house. My dad always had handguns as well, or pistols, semi-automatics, and we would just go to the range and practice. So from a young age, I've been involved in firearms, but having the opportunity to actually do some research on them was pretty cool. and having access to the data sets that we had as well, which were, I believe, 11 different law enforcement agencies provided data on what is known as unintentional discharges. Let's see, what else have I done in relation to firearms? I have a Sig Sauer concealed carry firearm, which is a small semi-automatic handgun. I also have a Smith & Wesson competition pistol, which I've not fired in quite some time, but it's a pretty nifty little thing, great for target shooting. And we also have a Beretta 92, which is the firearm of choice for many police departments in, I believe, the early to mid-90s. It was the firearm of choice. It's a very reliable double-action semi-automatic firearm. I've also shot, or actually I have a bolt-action rifle, and I also have an antique side-by-side drilling shotgun, which is a side-by-side shotgun that also has a rifle barrel mounted underneath. If you want to take a look on the internet for those, they're pretty cool. Drilling in German actually means triplet, so you have 3 shots with that firearm. It's a pretty cool firearm. I've also fired many other types of firearms, like black powder revolvers, which are pretty crazy, AK and AR style rifles. So, I mean, a decent amount of experience from a public perspective, I suppose, and not on the military or police level, but a little bit of experience, so I know how guns work and generally the mechanisms involved. How about you, Don?
So when I think about my firearms experience, I immediately think of like paintball and airsoft, this version of
I played paintball
whatever
too.
that is.
Lots of fond memories playing paintball.
I hid in a ravine and my shoes were wet and my heart was pumping and I was so excited just to be there playing with a bunch of guys that were in the military and whatnot, and I was just yeah, I'll come along. So I had fun just kind of frolicking around in the woods, I'd say, more than anything else. But I've gone to the range with John. I did a concealed carry course with John as well. Fired a variety of different handguns and a revolver and semi-automatic. I've also fired an AR in rural areas of the woods and different places.
As you do in many areas of this country?
Yeah, kind of in the Midwest and the South, and then also on the range. But not nearly as much experience as John has. And you were mentioning all of these different fantastic types of firearms, and you got a lot of those from your dad too, right? Didn't he pass a lot of those down to you?
Yeah, a lot of those firearms were handed down. They've been in the family for quite some time. The side-by-side shotgun is actually from Germany, I believe. I'm not sure. I'll have to ask my dad exactly what the story is on that gun, but it's a pretty cool antique, something you could put out on display, and it's a very interesting looking firearm.
So I would say my learning curve was significantly longer in doing this research, and I knew it was very important work to do to look at firearm safety and to understand how unintentional discharges occur. What are the circumstances? What's the context? What kind of stress level is the officer under during them? But we really need to define that term before we move forward.
Unintentional discharges, you mean?
Mm-hmm. And why that term?
Yeah. Well, so unintentional discharges is our term of choice. There are a couple of other terms that are commonly used out there. One is accidental discharge, and the other is negligent discharge. And I believe, I'm not sure, but I think those originated in the military. And typically when you're talking about an accidental discharge, you're talking about a failure of some sort to do with the firearm itself, whether that be a cracked frame or a faulty trigger, something along those lines. On the other hand, a negligent discharge is often seen as the fault of the person handling the firearm, and they made some mistake in handling the firearm, and that's typically labeled a negligent discharge. unintentional discharge encompasses both of those, at least how we define it. So I can just read through the definition that we came up with. So an unintentional discharge was operationally defined as an activation of the trigger mechanism of the firearm that results in an unplanned discharge that is outside of that firearm's prescribed use. So, prescribed use refers to the departmental policies and laws related to the operation of firearms. And to be clear, this excludes a situation where a subject gains control of an officer's firearm and activates the trigger mechanism themselves, or an event in which an officer intentionally shoots a suspect, regardless of the situation. So basically what we're talking about here are accidents. They're errors.
They're errors.
Yeah, errors is probably the better term to use.
Human error, or operator error, or the device's error itself. So it encompasses both. And from a behavior analytics standpoint, this definition was brilliant, in my opinion, because it removes intent, even though intent is a part of the term itself. We were trying our best to have a behavior analytic definition that does not speak about something being, intentional or unintentional, or placing blame on the individual, but rather trying to describe things in non-mentalistic terms.
And trying to avoid a circular definition as well. Our definition does have unplanned in there, which is quite similar to intent, but it's hard to avoid that when you're talking about this type of phenomenon. But if anyone out there listening has a better variation of the definition, we'd love to hear it. So you have these three terms: the accidental, negligent, or unintentional discharge, and we consider unintentional discharges as covering all of those other terms. And if you need a well-known example of this, you need to look no further than the quintessential example that was provided by Pulp Fiction, pun intended, by the way. So poor Marvin in the back of the car gets shot because the philosophical hitmen, Vincent and Jules, are having an existential crisis, having just escaped a near-death experience involving hamburgers. And if you take a look at that video, that shows, obviously, Vincent did not intend to shoot Marvin in the back seat. And it's a neat little scene that gives you kind of an idea of exactly what we're talking about here. All right. Anything to add so far?
No, I'm all set.
All right. So,
besides, what I was thinking is, so when I mentioned mentalism earlier, I mean, we're thinking we're speaking to a lot of behavior analysts out there, but there might be people listening that don't have behavior analytic training. And so when we're talking about mentalism, we're largely speaking about hypothetical constructs that are very difficult to define. So when you talk about intent, how do you define that? How do you see it? How do you measure it? So we're really trying to define our term in a way that is measurable. Mm-hmm. Without incorporating hypothetical constructs, which was quite the task.
Indeed. So, unintentional discharges and firearms. So, a number of different factors come into play. You obviously have the firearm itself. So let's talk about some of the mechanisms of firearms and how different firearms sort of differ and vary in comparison to one another. So one of the big ones, and perhaps one of the more important, is the trigger mechanism, the trigger action of firearms. If you're not familiar with firearms, they all have triggers, right? They're all more or less the same? Not at all. They can vary widely in their trigger action and the effort that you have to put forth in order to pull the trigger. So a lot of firearms have what's considered a double action trigger, single action trigger, or a preset trigger. So these are quite different types of triggers. A double action trigger pulls back the hammer, which is what strikes the round in the chamber. The double action, so the first part of the action is pulling the hammer back, and the second part of the action is releasing the trigger so that it can strike the round. A single action trigger does only one thing. It only releases the hammer. So the hammer is already cocked back and in place, ready for you to pull the trigger, which makes it substantially easier to engage that trigger action. A preset trigger, which is common in Glock firearms, they refer to it as a striker trigger, is their trademark, but we call it a preset trigger because the hammer is sort of half-cocked right off the bat, so it's kind of halfway in between a double and a single action trigger. So it basically pulls the hammer back slightly and then releases it, but what that allows the manufacturer to do is modify the trigger poundage, the amount of effort it takes to actually pull the trigger. So that brings us to trigger poundage. That's the weight of the trigger. And believe it or not, you can modify the weight of the trigger quite substantially. So a lot of triggers can be lightened up to the tune of decreasing the weight by a few 100%. I mean, so you can modify the weight of the trigger so that it's much easier to pull the trigger, which, as you can imagine, might make it more susceptible to being pulled and resulting in an unintentional discharge. All right, any questions there or any other comments?
Yeah, so what's interesting for me, just as a woman operating different firearms, is that the trigger action and poundage can, I think, make a difference perhaps in my accuracy or the way I'm handling a firearm. And other researchers picked up on this because some departments were moving over to Berettas, which have a heavier trigger poundage, meaning you have to engage in more effort to overcome that trigger mechanism.
And the Beretta's a double action, which is going to affect that poundage as well, yeah.
It's going to increase that poundage. So some researchers looked at the differences between men and women on the police force operating Berettas and found that accuracy decreased slightly for women who were using Berettas significantly more than men. And they also looked at grip strength and found that it was significantly lower than that of men as well. So, of course, I'm advocating that there should be equal opportunity for people of all genders to participate in law enforcement. But it's also important to consider this tool, which could be a life-saving tool, operated under extreme circumstances out in the field. I mean, we know that most officers go through their career without ever firing their handgun in the field, but if the situation arises that might call for using a firearm out in the field, you definitely want to put yourself in a position of advantage and be able to have a high level of accuracy. So this information on the mechanisms of firearms is very important.
Yeah, and think about if you have a small hand. It's not as though the manufacturer has a small, medium, and large version of each of the firearms. I mean, you can get that.
You can get cute little pink firearms.
Yeah, but you have to spend a lot of money getting a custom-sized grip or trigger well, that kind of thing. So typically, officers are going to have a one-size-fits-all firearm, and if it happens to be a double-action trigger, you may have more difficulty. Regardless of sex, obviously. But if you just have a smaller hand, you may have difficulty operating that firearm. The other piece that comes into play is the grip. So the grip might be of such a width that it's more difficult for you to hold onto the firearm if you have a smaller hand. So multiple design factors come into play as well when it comes to comfort and ability to operate and handle the firearm appropriately. which is something I honestly hadn't really thought about at all before diving into this data analysis. It's interesting how many things come into play when you start looking at all of the details and mechanisms involved in firearms.
And you were right, by the way, it's called a hairline trigger. Mm-hmm. And that's when a firearm responds to very slight pressure. And then they have a term adapted into psychology called a hairline trigger temper, of when someone kind of just flies off the handle at basically nothing.
So let's get into the results of the 3 studies that we conducted. So just kind of bird's eye view takeaways from each of the studies. So study 1 provided empirical data to support some of the existing claims. We should probably talk about what some of those are. So there were 3 general causes that were assumed in law enforcement to be the cause of unintentional discharges: a startle response, a loss of balance, and a contralateral contraction in a muscle group that was not the muscle group involved in pulling the trigger.
So can you give some examples?
Yeah, so if you are forcefully pushing open a door, for example, that's either weighted or just heavy, forceful exertion with your non-firearm hand will cause some level of contraction of the muscles in the firearm hand as well. So if you're holding your firearm while exerting extreme force to try and either break down a door or kick a door open, sometimes you have activation of the muscle groups that involve the firearm and the trigger mechanism.
Especially when your finger is already on the trigger.
Absolutely. If your finger happens to be already in the trigger well, which officers do not train to do, they train to keep the trigger finger along the barrel outside of the trigger well. But if your finger happens to be in the trigger well, there's a chance that muscle co-activation could occur and you would have an unintentional discharge.
What about a startle reaction? What's an example of that?
There were some great examples in the study, the second study actually, where we identified a gunshot by another officer actually startled a backup officer who then squeezed the trigger of their firearm and shot a round into the ground. So that'd be an example of a startle response. And then loss of balance. Picture yourself, you're chasing an assailant and you're running upstairs or downstairs. You lose your balance. You try to grab onto something, the railing. If you have your firearm in your hand, there's a chance you could pull the trigger. That'd be an example of that. We also, with study 1, identified a variety of behaviors on the part of the officer. So what was the officer doing leading up to the unintentional discharge? Were they running? Were they sitting at their desk? Were they in the locker room? Were they on the firing range? And what behaviors were they engaging in? So we were able to identify quite a few behaviors, but ultimately they could all be grouped into 6 categories and many different contexts in which unintentional discharges occurred. And we also found that unintentional discharges may not necessarily occur with any particular type of firearm, because we had many different types of firearms with different trigger mechanisms, with different trigger poundage. But it was a limited sample, so maybe a larger sample would point us in the direction of perhaps single action light triggers. Maybe those are more likely to result in unintentional discharges. However, I suspect that it has more to do with the training that goes along with a particular firearm.
Yeah, absolutely, because if we receive data and there were a higher percentage of unintentional discharges with a certain type of firearm, that may very well be due to the fact that the majority of departments use a particular type of firearm. So that does not mean that that firearm in and of itself is more or less safe, but perhaps there are more opportunities for unintentional discharges because there are more of that specific tool out there being used.
Mm-hmm. And there's actually been some controversy about this because one department, we won't name departments, but actually two departments in the same state used or adopted a preset trigger mechanism firearm, and one department had an uptick in unintentional discharges while the other did not. So what ended up happening was the department blamed the firearm as being responsible for the uptick in unintentional discharges, but when you look a little bit deeper, you see that one department had a much more in-depth training on that new firearm, whereas the other did not. So it's more likely that the intensive training or more intensive training of one department may and probably did influence the number of unintentional discharges. Interesting.
Mm-hmm.
All right, study 2, the general takeaways from that. It was the first study, we believe, to identify an official report of a startle response causing an unintentional discharge. So this fella, Dr. Anoka, who is a physiologist, I believe, generalized what he understands about muscle activation and the physiology of human muscle groups to unintentional discharges, and he came up with those 3 initial categories: the startle response, loss of balance, and contralateral contraction. But there was, at that time, no evidence in official reports that a startle response could actually result in an unintentional discharge, and we found one such report that provided that evidence, so that was pretty cool. We also added in study 2 some international data to our set, which increased our sample size, obviously, and gave us a wider range of the types of firearms and trigger mechanisms. We actually had a good-sized chunk of double-action handguns in that study, and double-action firearms are relatively rare nowadays in law enforcement. Most of them use either a single action or a preset, again, striker type mechanism.
Mm-hmm. And studies 1 and 2 also provided some information on injuries, and that some of the officers had self-inflicted injuries due to unintentional discharges, or a subject had an injury, and there was also a death of an officer who they believe had an unintentional discharge when trying to get out of his patrol car at the end of his shift, and his gun became connected with, I believe, his radio antenna, and the safety was off. He had a round in the chamber, and he shot himself in the femoral artery and succumbed to his injuries. So this, again, relays the very real consequences, possible fatal consequences of unintentional discharges.
Yeah, absolutely. And there were a couple of examples of officers practicing quick draws in front of one another, not realizing that their weapon was loaded, unfortunately. Those officers were injured but did not die, thankfully. But I think that those particular incidents point to how easily you can become complacent when handling firearms. If you're handling them every day and you're comfortable around them, and if you're comfortable with the firearm, it's easy to become complacent and not follow the appropriate safety steps. So
I think that's an important takeaway also from those studies is I was under the impression, at least, that the majority of unintentional discharges were going to occur out in the field when officers were startled or they lost their balance or they were, clearing an area and forcefully opening a door or a gate or something out in the field responding to a call, and that's when these were happening, and we found that was in fact not the case. And it's exactly what John is describing here, that they were actually occurring under low stress environments such as on the shooting range while training and being complacent with firearms. And so that's why now we're going to get into firearm safety.
Yeah, so that's what Study 3 did. We combined the two data sets, and from that information we were able to develop some recommendations for training practices. So what we came up with were universal or general recommendations for firearm use and handling, and we also came up with some targeted interventions for the particular subgroups of officer behavior that led to unintentional discharges. So we'll go through that list and provide some additional comments. This table is Table 4 in the Journal of Organizational Behavior Management publication. And so we'll start with the universal. So system-wide promotion of safety procedures through motivating operations and reinforcement strategies. So very general advice, but what that comes down to is setting firearms training up so that the folks in training want to come back and want to learn more about safe firearm use and become more confident and competent in their skills relevant to firearms. And some departments have some of these things in place, like they pay for the ammunition. If you go and practice on your own time at the police range, you have unlimited ammo. You can fire as many rounds as you want. Anyone out there who's listening who uses firearms knows that it's pretty expensive stuff, especially if you're using the round that you would actually use in practice. It's easy to go out and use like a 22 caliber round. Those are cheap, but it's not the same sort of kickback that you get with the firearm. It doesn't feel the same. So you really want to be practicing with the actual round that you're going to use in practice, but that can be really expensive. So something some departments do is provide the ammunition for you if you're willing to come in and practice, which I think is pretty cool. They also set up all sorts of games. One of the academies that we worked with had like a weekly, a weekly challenge they had. So you had to shoot within a certain grouping. Grouping meaning your bullets are all within a certain distance of one another. A tight grouping means that you're basically creating as close to the same hole with each bullet as possible, which is very difficult. But they would have these cool challenges up to encourage people to come in and practice their skills, which obviously is going to include safety skills and the safe operation of their firearms as well. Anything to add there?
I think behaviorally, for behavior analysts listening, you can think of a tight grouping on a target, meaning high reliability of shooting in the same location again and again and again.
Mm-hmm. Another piece, and this is more general even than the first one, but it's because we only had we had one instance where an officer had a seizure, and that caused them to pull the trigger on their firearm. And I believe that officer injured themselves as well. We should note, too, that the vast majority of these incidents, no one was hurt. The round ended up either in the floor or a wall or in a desk TV. Or in somebody else's hotel room or a TV. Yeah, do you remember that story about the TV? Do you want to tell that one?
Yeah, an officer was practicing quick draw of pulling the firearm out of the holster and pulling the trigger, shooting it as quickly as possible, just like an old Western, and was watching an old Western on TV at the time in his hotel room, waiting for his buddy to pick him up for, I think, training.
He had qualifications the next day, actually. He was practicing for qualifications, obviously nervous about his qualifications.
And he wanted to be fast and accurate. And so he had unloaded the weapon, taken out the magazine before practicing, and then his buddy calls and says, all right, I'm on my way, I'll be there soon. He puts the magazine back in, puts the gun back in the holster. His buddy doesn't show up for a few more minutes, so he decides to go back to practicing quick draws. And this is a bit of, that human error, and that he forgets then to clear his magazine, which is 101 in firearm safety training.
He engaged in the practice behavior again.
Yes,
Forgot that he had reloaded the magazine.
So he pulled the trigger, and the gun was loaded, and his weapon discharged in his hotel room into the TV.
Yeah.
Fortunately, no one was injured.
So back to the seizure. We had one instance where a seizure resulted in unintentional discharge. So there's a general recommendation to minimize chronic stress, fatigue, and drug use, which can all result in effects on muscle usage. The third universal or general recommendation was, and this is widely accepted and promoted in just about any arena where you talk about firearms, assume that all firearms are loaded at all times. Double check, triple check the firearm to make sure that it is not loaded. You can do a physical check where you actually put your finger, you pull the slide back if you're not familiar with a slide. Semi-automatic handguns have a slide that can be pulled back so that you can see the back end of the barrel, and you can visually inspect to see whether or not there's a round in the chamber, and you can also tactile check and put a finger in the back end of, not the front, the back end of the barrel.
Not in the front of the barrel.
To check to make sure that there's nothing in there. There's a great video of Master Ken. Look up Master Ken online and firearm use. He has some fantastic jokes. But yeah, always assuming that firearms are loaded, and if there's any doubt, run another check. The fourth general recommendation is practice indexing. Indexing is a term that means basically your trigger finger, which is your index finger, is pointed in a straight line as if you're making a toy gun movement or demonstration with your hand, with your index finger pointed out. That should go along and follow the line parallel with the barrel of the firearm. And what that does is prevent, if you were to have a startle response or some other muscle contraction, if the finger does flex, it's going to hit against the side of the firearm as opposed to slipping into the trigger well and potentially pulling the trigger. And you would want to practice that in a bunch of different environments. Ideally under high stress, right? You want to be able to engage in that indexing behavior under high stress conditions and be used to doing that. There was another study that we cited in, I think, most of our papers that showed that even high-level operators during stressful scenario-based firearms training did not realize that during the scenario they actually placed their finger inside of the trigger well. So they had, I think they had video recordings or sensors that allowed them to identify that, in fact, during the scenario, your finger was not indexed. It was within the trigger well. And these participants were not aware that that happened. Perhaps they were in the moment, but after the fact, they didn't remember doing that. So there's a chance that under high stress, officers will preemptively place their finger in the trigger well, which obviously places them at much higher danger of an unintentional discharge. So practicing in a variety of contexts under a variety of stress levels would be key for the indexing behavior.
And we've also done some research on traffic stops, and we haven't published the data related to a startle reaction because it's kind of anecdotal. We didn't intend to study it, but something we saw when reviewing all the footage. And this was a traffic stop study conducted, around a decade ago now. But we had officers conducted a traffic stop 3 different times, and on the third trial, the assailant pulled out a firearm and started shooting at the officer. And so we could look at the movement patterns of how the officer disengaged. But in that moment, when the officer was already fired at, we saw the officer jump up. Their feet sometimes come off the ground, or they put their hands up in front of their face or out. And so, your body is going to do things in that half second. And if that finger is in the trigger well, there's a good chance that you're going to discharge your firearm.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the loss of balance one is the best example of that. Think about if you've ever slipped on an icy stairwell or just a wet stairwell. Immediately your hands fly out to grab onto something and grasp onto something. And if you already have a firearm in your hand and your finger happens to be in that trigger well, you're going to pull that trigger. And hopefully you don't hit somebody or damage something important.
Yeah, and pulling it out of firearms, thinking about how many times you've gone and had your iced coffee throughout the summer or your hot coffee, and if you slip and you fall and you've got your coffee in your hand, even if you just slip a little bit, you probably have crunched your cup a little bit. It's like that, but a lot more serious.
Yeah. So the 5th general recommendation was that when appropriate, point the firearm away from any suspect until the decision to shoot is made. Now that can be just slightly offline, but obviously you don't want to point a firearm at anything that you're not willing to destroy. And that's a general recommendation that's pretty common as well. If you're not willing to put a bullet in something, you don't want to put a bullet in something, don't ever point the firearm at it. And that's why at ranges, they recommend that you always have the firearm pointed down range. Even if it's unloaded, you always face it in the safest direction possible. And obviously, officers need to have that firearm at ready, and they need to be able to get on target as soon as possible, but just having it slightly offline until the decision to shoot is made reduces the chances of an unintentional discharge.
And so law enforcement officers will often refer to this position as a low ready, and it's when their firearm is pointed downward at about a 45-degree angle, parallel to the ground in front of them, and the floor, about 45 degrees and downward. So if you did fire the weapon outside of its prescribed use, that bullet would be going down into the ground.
Right. It's either going to hit the ground or go to the side of the suspect and hopefully hit a wall or something solid other than another human being.
Yeah, not ricochet off something and then cause injury, because that is something that happens sometimes as well.
Right, and that's another piece that goes into police training, is looking beyond the target and being aware of what's behind the target too, because most commonly used rounds are going to go through whatever target it hits and could potentially hit something that's in the background as well. And I should specify that piece about not pointing the firearm directly at a suspect until the decision to shoot isn't going to necessarily decrease the chances of an unintentional discharge, but if you do experience one, if the round is off to the side, you're obviously not going to hit that person. So it reduces the chances of injury to a suspect, a bystander, or sometimes another officer if they're surrounding a suspect. All right, so those are the universal or general recommendations that we made. We also made targeted recommendations based on the 6 subgroups of behavior that led up to unintentional discharges. So I'll talk about each of those as we go through the targeted recommendations. So contact with an object. That means that the officer was holding their firearm and that the firearm contacted some object. You mentioned the radio antenna previously that slipped into the trigger well, and the pressure was enough to activate the trigger mechanism. But you can imagine any number of solid objects that might slip into the trigger well could potentially activate the trigger mechanism. So that's our first behavioral category that we defined. And our recommendation was because some of these incidents involved a firearm that was holstered, but that something was still able to slip into the holster and activate the trigger mechanism. So the recommendation is to utilize a holster that is specifically designed for that firearm and minimizes or eliminates any gap where objects could be inserted into the holster. And then training to include identification and avoidance of any objects that might enter the trigger guard. So just being aware of things that could potentially slip into the trigger well.
Including the index finger, right? Because
Including
some
the index
holsters,
finger, yeah.
officers would accidentally slip the finger into the trigger well. So having a holster in which it's more easy to index as the firearm is being removed from the holster.
And the second one was medical symptoms. So we had one officer who had a seizure, not necessarily a behavior, although it depends how you define it. But obviously regular checkups, if an officer does have a seizure disorder, making sure that they're taking their medications and maintaining strict adherence to whatever prescription medication regimen there is. And again, this was a single case that we identified. So if it weren't for that case, this wouldn't even be a part of our taxonomy, I don't think, because we wouldn't have thought about it.
Well, and I think of beyond officers with anyone that might operate a firearm, with anyone with a concealed carry permit as well, and how checkups are very important for anyone that's going to be operating something that can take life.
Yeah, absolutely. Muscle coactivations. So this goes along the lines of the contralateral contraction that I spoke about before that Inoka initially suggested. And our recommendation was training to include forceful behaviors such as jumping, kicking, pulling, pushing, and running while holding an unloaded firearm, because we want to practice in a safe manner, so maybe use a training gun for this as well. And maybe use a non-lethal training ammunition as well, so that if the firearm is discharged, there's that immediate feedback for the officer. Oh, I did something wrong there. And indexing, obviously, the finger along the side of the barrel. Also, regular practice activating weapon-mounted flashlights, lasers, or other switches. And probably many of the listeners, if you're not familiar with the military or law enforcement, don't realize that you can mount flashlights and lasers on your duty firearm, and they're often either activated by a switch, like a dial type switch, or a pressure trigger. And unfortunately, those folks who designed the pressure activated laser sights and flashlights did not pay enough attention to the placement of that pressure switch, because I believe quite a few of them are mounted right below where the trigger finger activates the actual trigger mechanism. So what you want to do is, if you do have a laser or a flashlight mounted on your firearm, you want to practice with that over and over and over to make sure that you have a well-practiced trigger finger and whichever finger is operating that other tool that's mounted on your firearm.
And coactivation also in terms of having a flashlight in one hand and the firearm in the other when it's not actually weapon mounted, but just having both, and then doing a crossover. First of all, your brain could get confused on which arm it's operating, or if you're operating the flashlight, you could have some muscle coactivation that way too.
The last piece of this is do not attempt to catch a falling firearm. So this came from multiple examples of typically officers off-duty at their house, getting ready for bed, or undressing out of their duty attire and just changing into their regular clothes, placing their firearms on the dresser, and for one reason or another it becomes dislodged and begins falling. The officer tries to catch the firearm. It's a sort of a natural kind of response to a falling object. You automatically try to reach out and grab it and stop it from hitting the ground. Unfortunately, if you grasp the firearm mid-fall and your finger happens to go on that trigger well, unintentional discharge again, right? Mm-hmm. So just let it fall. Firearms are designed to hit the ground, no matter the condition, the loaded condition, the cocked hammer, it doesn't matter. They're designed not to discharge if they fall on the ground, so just let it go. The next behavioral group are routine tasks, and these made up a large proportion of the overall number of unintentional discharges. So routine tasks are just non-stressful, daily routine in the office, doing paperwork, going to the bathroom, going to the changing room, going to your lockers, unloading the firearms from the car, transferring them from one area to another. So these are presumably relatively low-stress situations and behaviors that don't involve a heightened level of stress.
Right, and fairly close to 0% threat, besides the threat that comes with just operating one's own firearm.
Sure, which, if you're comfortable with your firearm, should be next to zero.
Right.
Okay, so our recommendations for routine tasks were, again, check visually and tactilely the chamber of the firearm before clearing meaning unloading the firearm, cleaning, function checks. Function check is a fancy word we came up for dry fire. Dry fire with firearms is pulling the trigger and releasing the hammer when there's no ammunition in the firearm to make sure that it's empty. This is typically done on firing ranges. They'll have a highly reinforced canister that officers can point the barrel of the gun into and pull the trigger. And if there does, for some reason, happen to be a round in there and it's discharged, it's going to go into this highly reinforced canister. That's another safety precaution that they take on firing ranges. And checking before any sort of maintenance as well. If you're going to disassemble and maintain the firearm, which involves typically cleaning it up and re-oiling the firearm, you want to obviously make sure that it's not loaded prior to taking the firearm apart, because certain firearms in the disassembly process, some of them actually require pulling the trigger in order to disassemble the firearm, which I think is it's a bit of a design flaw. But nevertheless, being aware that is a possibility and making sure that you check to make sure that it is definitely unloaded before you do any sort of maintenance on the firearm. Let's see. Startle responses. So again, we had a few examples of this, but in order to incorporate this into training, you want to have all sorts of sudden movement, sudden sounds. Maybe somebody touches you on the shoulder during a high-stress scenario. Maybe involves some loss of balance, running on uneven ground. You obviously, as we talked about in our last podcast, you want to avoid the potential for injury, but you also need to train in these scenarios where any number of different things could arise, and officers need to be able to handle their firearms in a variety of different situations like that. And the way to do that is obviously through routine practice and repetitions. Again, the indexing of the trigger finger is going to help with a startle response. If that finger is not inside the trigger well, the chances of an unintentional discharge are going to be lower than if they were in the trigger well.
I think there's a theme here.
And what would that be?
In regards to the index finger.
Uh-huh.
And that it should be indexed and not in the trigger well.
Yeah, it sounds simple, but when you're operating a firearm, you want to be as ready as possible, and the closest you can be to discharging a firearm without discharging a firearm is having your finger on the trigger in the trigger well. But when you consider things such as unintentional discharges, the time that it takes to move your finger from outside the trigger well to inside the trigger well is quite short, but from a tactical standpoint, I can understand why an officer might prefer to have their finger inside the trigger well. But if you're going to do that, you need to be an expert and highly practiced at engaging in that behavior. All right, the final one is an unfamiliar task. So we identified a few behaviors where the officer reported that they had not engaged in that behavior previously, either during practice or on the range or in the field. So these are tasks that they were not practiced at and had not engaged in training. So our recommendations for this were immediate and intensive training on any new firearm or holster. So something as simple as a change in the departmental policy on which default firearm is used. If they move from a double action trigger firearm to a single action trigger firearm, which typically has a much lighter trigger pull, you're going to need to practice and become proficient with that type of trigger. Otherwise, you're going to be used to pulling a heavy trigger, and you may overexert the pulling of the new trigger, which is much lighter and only activates the release of the hammer as opposed to having to pull the hammer back against the spring strength. So it's important that anytime you start using any new equipment, that you practice with that equipment. If it's a new holster, there are different levels of holsters in the policing world. So you have multiple safety mechanisms built into holsters, and you have to press buttons, you have to slide latches, you have to engage in additional behaviors that need to be practiced if you're going to competently handle your firearm and avoid unintentional discharges.
And same for duty belts. If you're going to use a new or a different duty belt that has a different configuration for all of the tools on it, you want to be very well practiced to not mistake your firearm for a taser and accidentally shoot someone instead of tasing them.
Yeah, there were, there have been some high-profile examples of that where an officer's firearm used to be on their, I can't remember which side it was either on their left or right, and for one reason or another the policy changed, and now the firearm had to be on the opposite side of the body. So when that officer went to draw their taser, they actually drew their firearm, which, ergonomically speaking, feels very similar to the handle of the taser. So that's a bit of a, not necessarily a design flaw, but from an ergonomics standpoint, you don't want your taser handle or grip and your firearm grip feeling similar. You want them to be noticeably different so that if you do grab the wrong one, there's some tactile feedback that lets you know, oh, I'm not holding my firearm, I'm holding my taser, or vice versa.
And because they are so similar, it would probably be advisable to never switch one out in terms of location on the duty belt to avoid or minimize the risk of making that error.
Yeah, imagine the officer who's been using the same firearm for 10 years, and then there's a policy change, new firearm, and also you're going to have to wear it on the opposite side of your body. Or not necessarily the opposite side of the body, but a different location. You know, it's slightly behind, or it's been repositioned on your belt, or perhaps it's in a different location altogether. But, so unfamiliar tasks. You want to engage in regular practice, firing with flashlights, lasers, as you mentioned before, arms in a crossover position. Often officers, if it's dark out, they will have their arms crossed over, one arm holding the firearm and the other holding a flashlight pointing in the same direction as the firearm, as a way to obviously light the area that they're aiming in. So if that's something that is a potential, then we need to practice that over and over until we're completely comfortable and competent in engaging in that behavior. And the last piece was using your non-dominant hand. So this comes into play if, for one reason or another, your dominant or firearm arm, which for me is my right arm, if I lose the ability to use that arm for some reason, I get a bad cut, perhaps I've been shot, perhaps I've...
You need to use another tool in your duty belt with your right hand, and you want to switch the gun to your left hand.
Sure.
I've seen a video of that, of an officer on a traffic stop.
Yeah, if you'd like to see that video, we can post that up in the links. But yeah, if you need to transfer your firearm to the other hand for some reason, because if that's your dominant hand, then you're likely going to use your baton or just about any other tool with that hand as well. So if that becomes necessary, you have to move your firearm to the other non-dominant hand. Or if you lose the ability to use that dominant arm, you need to be proficient in using the firearm in the other hand. So I think that's something that a lot of folks, especially when I go to ranges to practice, I don't see people practicing in both hands. And honestly, it's something I need to start doing as well. But it's a very real thing in law enforcement. They need to be able to use their firearm in both hands.
So the most general takeaway from me from conducting all of this research is that the overwhelming majority of unintentional discharges are preventable. And what it really comes down to is basic firearm safety, and whoever is operating a firearm, for them not to become complacent and following just the basic firearm safety 101 from the academy, from any training that you've had as an operator of a firearm, to avoid making very real and potentially injurious, if not fatal, mistakes.
Yeah, definitely. So that wraps up our discussion of unintentional discharges in law enforcement. If you'd like to learn more about this, we have multiple magazine publications in the Police Chief magazine, and you can also obviously check out our research articles, and there's additional information on our website that you can have a look at. Unintentional discharges are very rare, I would say, in law enforcement. However, they can have very serious life-threatening consequences. So very important to analyze these and gather as much information as we possibly can, but the low frequency of them makes it very difficult to actually get video footage of them occurring. There are a few examples online. You can do a search for them. Use either unintentional, accidental, or negligent discharge, and you'll see a variety of circumstances in which these incidents were actually caught on camera, but very difficult to set up an experimental design where you actually see and can record these instances. So difficult phenomenon to study, but we're very happy to have access to official reports where we can try to become more aware of the behaviors, context, and the mechanisms involved in firearms that might contribute to unintentional discharges. If you have any questions, or if you have information that you think might be useful to us, feel free to comment and shoot us emails and all that. And otherwise, we'll see you on the next episode of the Public House Podcast.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Maybe you think I'm somebody else.